The Riverside Hotel stood tall and proud on the banks of the Mississippi River, its red brick facade having witnessed over a century of comings and goings. Once a luxurious destination for the wealthy riverboat crowd, it had faded into a modestly priced establishment that drew a steady stream of travelling salesmen, family road trippers, and curious ghost hunters. It was the ghost hunters who kept the legends alive about the most infamous room in the hotel, room 206. Stories had circulated for decades about the unexplained phenomena reported by those who dared to spend the night there. Ghostly shapes in the corners of sleepless eyes, blood-curdling screams that seemed to emanate from behind the walls, objects flying across the room as if propelled by unseen forces. The hotel staff avoided room 206 like the plague. Management kept it locked and removed all advertisements for its availability from their website and brochures. It was an unspoken rule that you simply didn't book guests into the dreaded 206 unless you had a death wish. That's why the old woman's request on that crisp autumn morning caught the young desk clerk off guard.
"I'd like the key to room 206, please,"
the petite woman said, her voice wavering but determined. Mark, the clerk, eyed her suspiciously while letting out her uncomfortable chuckle.
"Ma'am, you don't want that room. Trust me."
"Oh, but I do,"
she insisted, pushing a battered vintage suitcase along the scuffed tiled floor.
"You see, I was born in that room a very long time ago."
Mark's jovial expression turned to one of confusion and skepticism. This woman seemed quite lucid, though perhaps she was just another member of the endless parade of amateur ghost hunters who seemed to find the hotel.
"Really? You were born here? Well, this place has been around since the 1880s, so you'd have to be—"
102 years old?
She replied with a slight grin.
"Yes, that's right, young man. I'll be 103 next April."
Mark opened his mouth but couldn't find the words. She certainly looked every year of 102, tiny and frail with a welding of wrinkles across her face and hands. Her steel-grey hair was pulled back in a tidy bun, and she wore a long khaki skirt and plain white blouse that seemed from another era.
"You'll want to give me the key to 206,
she said firmly. It was more of a demand than a request. Not knowing how to respond, Mark swallowed hard and turned to retrieve the key from the mass savoring of the antique cabinet behind him. He remembered the warnings from his manager about that room, never to let anyone inside, no matter what. But there was something undeniably compelling about this old woman's piercing gaze and resolute conviction. Maybe she was just a kooky hotel guest, as she claimed. Or maybe she was a ghost herself.
"Here you go, ma'am,"
he said, trying to mask his trepidation as he slid the antique key across the counter.
"Room 206. I'll help you with your bag."
"No need,"
she replied, snatching the key without breaking eye contact.
"I know my way."
With that, she turned and started the long walk down the hotel's gloomy corridor to the staircase that led up to the second floor. Mark watched her go, feeling an eerie chill run down his spine. The old woman didn't seem to struggle at all climbing the stairs despite her hunched frame and cane. She made her way down the dimly lit hallway and stopped in front of the door marked 206, fumbling with the key for a moment before swinging it open. A musty, stale odour escaped from the room, like gas being expelled from an unearthed tomb. She peered inside, unperturbed, and slowly shuffled through the entryway. The inside of room 206 looked just as it had for the last several decades, trapped in a perpetual state of decay and disuse. Water stains marred the floral wallpaper, which was peeling off in long strips. A thin layer of dust coated every surface: the scarred wooden desk, the rusted metal footlocker, the bare mattress collapsed in on itself. Despite the dreary surroundings, the old woman's eyes immediately welled up with tears as a wave of memories flooded over her.
"It's just as I remember,"
she whispered, lowering herself down into the squeaky rocking chair beside the draughty window. She gazed around the room slowly, breathing in the nostalgic amalgam of scents, the faintest traces of her mother's rosewater perfume, her father's pipe tobacco, the ever-present moulding odour of the outdated wallpaper and decaying wood. Suddenly, a noise from behind the closed bathroom door caused her to jump. A heavy thump, like something large had fallen to the floor. Her heart raced as she remembered the many tales of haunted happenings in this room, but then, just as quickly, she relaxed.
I'm not afraid.
She said out loud, as if reassuring whatever unseen entity may lurk in that room.
This is my room. I have nothing to fear here.
As the seconds ticked by, she felt a profound sense of comfort and nostalgia wash over her, as though she had returned to the womb. She could almost see the ghostly imprints of past moments replaying around her, her tiny crib in the corner, her parents sitting on the bed, her mother frantically waving a fan to ease the sweltering summer heat. Lost voices and memories from a bygone era engulfed her like a warm embrace. She closed her eyes and leaned back in the weathered rocking chair, gently pushing off with her slippered feet to set it in a gentle back-and-forth rhythm. For a few blissful moments, she could almost imagine herself back in that humid summer night of 1921 when she entered this world in this very room. Her respite was short-lived, however, as another supernatural sound soon rang out, a blood-curdling wail that seemed to reverberate from the very walls around her. Her eyes shot open just as the closet door across the room began to slowly creak open, its rusted hinges screaming out in protest. The old woman's heart raced as the closet door swung wide, revealing a seemingly endless pit of swirling darkness within. She clutched the armrests of the rocking chair, frozen in fear and fascination, as a shadowy figure began to emerge from the inky black void. It pulled itself out in jerking, inhuman movements, rising up from the floor like a grotesque creature from the depths of hell itself. It had the vague form of a human figure, but its unnaturally long arms ended in sharp, scaly talons. Its body was covered in a coarse, matted hair and glistening pustulant boils. It had no eyes, only deep-set hollows in its monstrous skull-like face, where tiny wisps of black smoke seemed to seep from. The thing opened its mouth and let out another ear-piercing shriek, revealing rows of jagged fangs dripping with a thick black ooze. It tilted its head unnaturally, as if sniffing the air, then turned its eyeless face directly toward the old woman's direction. A guttural snarl rumbled up from the pit of its throat, and it began shambling across the room with surprising speed, hunched over like an animal stalking its prey. Within seconds, it reached the rocking chair and leaned over the old woman, its hot, putrid breath washing over her as it roared again. The old woman trembled in abject terror but did not cry out. Through the waves of nausea and panic crashing over her, a single memory suddenly flashed before her, herself as a newborn baby screaming in hunger, and that very same entity looming over her crib, seemingly calmed by her cries. Like a bird mesmerized by a snake, she couldn't look away from the hellish creature's eyeless sockets. And then, just as suddenly as it arrived, the ghastly spectre lifted its head, let out one final howl, and dissolved into a swirling smoky vapour that was rapidly sucked back into the depths of the closet. The old woman collapsed into the rocking chair, gasping for air and trembling uncontrollably. Silent tears streamed down her face as she struggled to process what she had just experienced. After several moments of wheezing, shallow breaths, she finally managed to calm herself. She knew that as a newborn, something had attached itself to her in this room, a dark force, an entity, a haunting presence that had followed her throughout her entire life like a shadow. On the rare occasions she felt its icy chill or caught glimpses of its wretched form lurking in her peripheral vision, she was brought back to those first weeks of existence in room 206. Her parents had been devout Catholics, who quickly realized something was profoundly wrong with their newborn daughter. They noticed her seemingly staring off into blank space, and recoiling at unseen forces. More than once, she would awake screaming through the night in sheer terror, her tiny brow glistening with perspiration. No matter how many priests they brought in to bless her and rid her of the entity's grasp, the haunting persisted. Her parents became reclusive hermits, fearful of taking their daughter out amongst the judgmental public and their sidelong stares. They never understood the root of the evil force plaguing their family, but from an early age they made her understand one thing. This room, the room where it all began, would forever be a doorway to the darkest realms of horror. Her childhood was consumed by the constant presence of the malevolent entity. It weighed on her like a chronic illness, manifesting in anxiety, night terrors, bouts of paranoia and despair. In adolescence, she had resigned herself to being forever tormented, forever at the mercy of this sinister force and its whims. In her 20s, she attended a series of magic circle meetings where a group of spellcasters, self-proclaimed witches, and occult healers attempted to rid her of the entity's grasp through increasingly bizarre and disturbing rituals. One cold October night, she was stripped naked and bound to a stone altar with ropes as the coven surrounded her in a trance-like state, chanting endlessly in unknown tongues as the freezing rain poured down. She suffered horrific lacerations and burns from the hot irons and branding instruments used in their frenzied efforts to release her from the demon's grip. But the entity never released its clawed hold over her. In the 1950s, she became infatuated with the era's industrial innovations and modern man's advancement of technology. She grew obsessed with the concept of chemically or electrically neutralizing the spirit, experimenting with psychotropic drugs and crude electroshock devices in a fanatical quest to exorcise the force within. Her personal life became consumed by this fixation, straining her marriage and leading to frequent joblessness and destitution as she poured what little money she had into her experiments. By the 1970s, she had grown into a reclusive hoarder, surrounding herself with the artifacts of her many failed excursions against the demon: dusty tomes of the occult, corroded electrical machines, shelves of pungent elixirs and potions. Her life was in shambles as she continued pursuing one crackpot exorcism scheme after another in a desperate effort to find peace. Over the decades, her obsession had eroded her physically and mentally until she was an emaciated, frail shell of her former self, overcome by fear and paranoia. The only constants in her life had been her tormentor's presence and the ever-present memories of room 206 where it had all begun. That's when she decided, in the winter of her life, that the only path to resolution lied in returning to that dreaded place and confronting the entity one final time. So here she was, over a century later, back in the womb from where the demon was spawned. She knew from her experiences that it was no ordinary haunting or ghostly presence. This was something much older, much more powerful and inexplicable. A prime evil that had inexplicably attached itself to her at birth and trailed her like a virulent pandemic, defying every attempt at an exorcism or cure for over 100 years. The shock of seeing its ghastly physical form had shaken her to her core, reducing her to a helpless, trembling child again. But this time, she would not run from it. This time, in that very room where her life descent into unending paranormal torment began, she would end it once and for all. She could feel its presence returning already, seeping out from the ether like a pestilent gas. Black tendrils of ethereal smoke began drifting around the edges of the room, slowly converging behind her in the corner until they amassed into an inky pool of darkness. The old woman lifted herself up from the rocking chair with surprising agility, her fear having fully transitioned into an icy resolve. She turned to face the swirling vortex of blackness taking shape in the corner, clenching her frail fists as she felt the demonic entity's presence growing stronger. Smoky talons began protruding from the roiling mass, grasping outward as if to pull itself into the physical realm once again. The woman's eyes narrowed as the vague outlines of a humanoid shape started emerging. Facial contortions set in a permanent howl of anguish, ropey, sinewy arms tipped with razor-sharp claws, emaciated ribcage heaving with obscene life.
I know what you are,
the old woman said defiantly, squaring her stance as the hellish spectre continued materializing before her eyes.
I've spent a lifetime fleeing from you, fearing you, loathing every withered breath that's kept me tethered to this mortal plane and your torment.
The apparition let out a guttural roar, rearing what remained of its lank, sinewy frame as it pulled itself fully upright. The woman could smell its putrid stench of decay and sulphur, but she didn't flinch.
But I will not die this way, cowering in submission, feeding you with my fear as I have for over a century,
she proclaimed. The entity opened its cavernous maw, shooting a dagger-like tongue out as a thick cloud of black flies swarmed from the depths of its throat, buzzing angrily as they amassed into a choking cloud around the old woman's head. Tiny, stinging bites peppered her face and hands, but still she did not cry out.
This ends here, in the womb where you first slithered into my world, you wretched thing,
she shouted, swatting away the biting insects.
We will die together in this place, my cage and yours.
With that proclamation, the woman reached up and grabbed the collar of her blouse, ripping it open with surprising force to expose her frail, withered chest. The demon let out a deafening screech and started backing away, as if realizing her intent. She pressed her fingers into the ancient, paper-thin flesh of her sunken torso until points of crimson started welling up. Closing her eyes, she plunged her bony hands into her own body without hesitation, gripping the taut strands of her internal organs as she let out a guttural howl that matched the entity's own inhuman wails. Spatter exploded across the already stained walls as the woman ripped her own viscera out in handfuls, collapsing to the floor in a pool of expanding carnage. The shrieking abomination recoiled, lashing out blindly as the noxious stench of death filled the musty air. Still, the woman wasn't done. Even as the white-hot lances of agony ripped through her core, her hazy vision caught sight of the ancient heating grate in the corner of the room. Using her last ounce of strength, she dragged herself across the floor, leaving a thick smear of blood and tangled intestines in her wake, and pulled herself up to the rusted metal opening. Staring deep into the narrow confines of the fire-blackened chamber, she saw that it fed directly into the old brick furnace that had heated the entire building over a century ago, when this was her childhood home. A plume of ancient coal ash and soot vented out, confirming the passage was clear and still linked to the outside world. With her last breaths, the old woman pushed herself forward, painfully contorting her mutilated body until she managed to slide head-first into the sooty grate, pulling herself inch by inch down the searing hot shaft of the long dormant furnace chute. Behind her, the demonic entity let out a shriek of fury, instinctively knowing her intent. It scrambled towards her, slashing at her bony ankles with its claws as she slipped further inside. But its bulk was too massive to follow through the constricted passage, and all it could do was howl in rage as she disappeared from view. The woman could feel her consciousness fading rapidly as the searing pain of the metal ductwork charring her flesh finally overcame her like a white-hot embrace of euphoric release. She was going to die here, just as she was born 102 years earlier, collapsing into the smouldering heart that had pumped life into this place for so many decades. She welcomed the oblivion, knowing her final gambit had worked. For just as her physical form would soon be forever trapped in the hermetic bowels of the building's decaying infrastructure, so too would the shadowed manifestation of evil she had battled her whole life. As the last flickers of the old woman's life ebbed away, she could feel the oppressive, icy presence of the entity squeezing through the narrow confines of the furnace duct behind her. It was no longer the amorphous, shapeless smog it once was, but rather a dense, viscous ooze, slithering forward with abnormal speed like a ravenous serpent through a too-tight passage. A part of the woman's addled mind recoiled in horror at condemning herself to this, being slowly devoured by the very evil she had sought to trap. But the alternative of allowing this ancient malefic force to persist and afflict others was worse than any pain she could endure. The undulating flow of brackish sludge quickly engulfed her bare feet, continuing its relentless push up over her ankles and calves as she ground further into the decaying metalwork. Each inch she was dragged through the scalding conduit stripped away more of her charred flesh, until her nerves sang with shrieks of pure anguish. Still, she pushed onward, resolute in her mission to lead this unholy scourge to its final hellish resting place. The vile Ichor's advance quickened, the entity's hunger growing as it sensed its prey's life force ebbing away. It flowed up over her thighs in glutinous waves, adhering to every contour of her withering husk, slowly absorbing her essence into its own amassed quagmire of decay and evil. Methodically, remorselessly, it continued its full-bodied immersion, sloughing off layers of seared tissue and drained veins until the woman was no more than a motionless hunk of defiled meat suspended in its grasp. With one thundering push, the entire noisome deluge thrust forward, expelling her mangled carcass out from the searing metal shaft and into the cavernous central chamber of the archaic furnace with a sickening crunch of bone. The old boiler room was just as it was over a century ago on the day of her inauspicious arrival into the world. The hulking iron furnace squatted like a ravenous leviathan beside the dusty coal chute. Chains and tools dangled along the soot-streaked walls, beside fading painted instructions, ordering "Feed me" in faded letters above the hungering maw of the scorched cast-iron door. As the last licks of life subsided from the old woman's shattered body, the hellish manifestation drew her remains deeper into its gelatinous bulk, savouring her essence in its terminal moments. Like an amoeba slowly devouring a bacterial cell, every scrap of her physical matter was absorbed into the infinite darkness of its mass. What possibly could have been mere seconds dragged into an eternity of endless void and frozen dissolution. For the first time in over a century, she felt an odd sense of calm peace, free of pain or burden, as her sense of reality collapsed into nothingness. But then, just as the twilight of her consciousness was about to flicker out into perpetuity, a jarring reversal occurred. The void started to collapse in on itself, drawing her individuated essence into an ever-contracting singularity, until suddenly her vision exploded back into painful corporeal existence. With a violent start, the old woman's eyes shot open once again as she gasped for air. But she was no longer trapped inside the roiling mass of humanoid sludge, inhabiting the aged furnace chamber. To her shock, she found herself outside in the bright sunlight, a cool breeze rustling through the trees behind what she recognized as the rear courtyard of the old hotel. She blinked hard, trying to process the jarring shift in her surroundings. Was she dead? Had the entity absorbed her very soul? Or was this merely another twisted illusion, the calm before its final onslaught? A chorus of faint, echoed voices pulled her attention towards the hotel's back entrance, where a bustling stream of townsfolk flowed to and fro, dressed in the fashions of the early 19th century. Horse-drawn wagons and carts intermittently clattered by, while pedestrians manoeuvred past vendors hawking fresh flowers and baked goods from wooden trays. The old woman tugged self-consciously at her tattered blouse and skirt, fully aware of how out of place her appearance was in this apparent step back in time. Wait, these were no mere threads, she realized. Her skin was smooth and taut, and when she bent her knee, the tendons and joints operated like a well-oiled machine, free of the arthritic aches she'd grown accustomed to over the last century. A dawning realization began creeping over the old woman as she examined her newfound youthful form. She hurried over to a rain barrel beside the hotel's rear kitchen entrance and peered at her wavering reflection in the collected water. Staring back was not the withered ancient crone she had become, but rather a vibrant young woman with skin still dewy with the flush of adolescence. Her steely grey hair had regained its natural chestnut lustre, and the web of wrinkles etched into her face had been erased, replaced by the soft, unmistakable countenance of her 17-year-old self.
Impossible,
she gasped, reaching up to touch the reflection's smooth skin in disbelief.
How is this possible?
Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what devilish trick the entity was playing now. Had it plucked her entire consciousness from the present era and transported it into the recesses of her own youth? That made no logical sense. She was here in the flesh, tangible and real as the barrel before her. A sudden pang of familiarity overcame her as she noticed the bustle of activity around the hotel's rear courtyard. Errand boys in knickers ferried heavy trunks and baggage about. Workers paused to wipe their sweat-soaked brows as they unloaded heaps of coal down the chute that fed the hungry furnace. Even the smells and sounds, the clomping of horses' hooves, the pungent clouds of coal smoke, the chatter of lively conversation and raucous laughter, she had experienced it all before. Of course. How could she have not recognized it immediately? This was the very day in the late spring of 1882 when she started her first job at the tender age of 17, as a maid at the very same riverside hotel. The enormity of the realization hit her like a hammer blow, causing her to stumble dizzily against the courtyard's brick outer wall. She had been plucked from the grips of death and the demon's foul embrace, hurled backwards through time to the literal starting point of her existence. Her mind swam as she processed the implications. Was this chance to relive her life anew, or merely another in the entity's long history of cruel deceptions? No. She simply couldn't dwell on the metaphysics of it for now. Every fibre of her being knew with certainty that she was here, in this time and place, and perhaps with that foreknowledge of the coming decades of misery, she could find a way to circumvent them entirely. The cacophony of voices near the courtyard's rear entrance pulled her back to the present moment. She recognized the barked orders of Mr. Silas Chubb, the hotel's ferryboat captain who would arrive each morning with a fresh crop of riverboat passengers. Evidently, one of the mighty Mississippi steamers had just disembarked, carrying new guests ripe for the young maid's attention. Straightening her apron, she hurried around to the rear entrance, keenly aware that her youthful energy and vigor would need to stay focused. The chaos of new arrivals descended upon her like a swarm of buzzing flies, trunks and bags haphazardly strewn about, the bellowing voices of porters jostling through the crowd, overwhelmed guests frantically asking a myriad of questions in a whirlwind of confusion. The old woman, no, young woman, she reminded herself, fell into the role with practiced ease. Her muscle memory took over as she gathered luggage and directed flustered arrivals to their rooms, all while exchanging affable barks of courtesy with the other hotel staff. So consumed was she with the flurry of activity and instruction, she barely had a chance to study the sea of faces streaming through the entrance, until one piercing shriek stopped her dead in her tracks. A bone-chilling female scream echoed from somewhere deep within the crowd, causing guests to scatter in every direction like startled cats. Then, echoing through the courtyard entrada, she saw an all-too-familiar face emerging from the sea of confused onlookers. It was the apparition, that very same hellish entity that had stalked her throughout her previous life. But something had changed in its manifestation. Gone was the dark, twisted depravity of its true form. Here it stood, appearing for all the world like a smartly dressed, matronly woman clutching at the arm of a middle-aged man beside her. The old woman felt her breath catch in her throat as she came face to face with the nattily dressed couple, who were now the focal point of the entire crowd's shocked attention. Even from 20 yards away, she recognized the unmistakable aura of malice and evil woven into the woman's features. It was the entity, without question, though it had cloaked its true wretched visage in the guise of an unassuming, well-to-do socialite. From the tightly knotted bun of her steel-grey hair to her taut, mirthless frown and beady onyx eyes, scanning the courtyard like an apex predator assessing its terrain, she exuded an air of frigid disdain and hostility. The man at her side, whom she clutched possessively, appeared to be her meek husband by all outward appearances. A portly fellow in an ostentatious waistcoat and silk cravat, with a ruddy complexion and bewildered countenance, as if still processing his wife's outburst. Yet there was no mistaking the stunned submission with which he passively absorbed her vice-like grip on his arm, terrified to draw her ire once more.
"Filthy, incompetent fools!"
The woman barked, her voice dripping with venom as she glared at the assembled hotel staff clustered around the entrance.
I should have known better than to expect any semblance of basic hospitality from this ramshackle hovel of an establishment.
Quailing porters and bellhops exchanged nervous sideways glances, but remained silent, not daring to provoke her any further. The young maid stared in horrified fascination, unable to tear her gaze away from the vile creature she knew lay just beneath the surface of the haughty dowager's skin.
"This is the room you've seen fit to quarter us in?"
The woman spat, producing a tarnished key from her clutched palm as she pointed an accusatory finger towards one of the porters.
"The very dregs. Why, it's hardly fit for your swine-faced staff."
The old woman felt a ripple of sickening clarity pass over her as she stared at the tarnished key's dangling number. 206. Her heart began pounding as the full realization of where, precisely, she had been transported along her life's timeline set in. This was the very date, perhaps even the exact hour, when the entity had first attached itself to her as a newborn in that wretched room over 50 years from now. It had plucked her backwards through the timeline to this pivotal moment, when it had first crossed paths with her human lineage and initiated its century-long curse. But why? She racked her brain, trying to comprehend what depravity this evil force could possibly have in store for her in sending her consciousness back to inhabit her own adolescent body. Was this merely another twisted form of torment, to allow her a glimpse of her life before the nightmare began, only to cruelly snatch it away? Or did it have something far more sinister and inscrutable planned? The young maid knew one thing for certain as she watched the imperious facade of the entity railing at the haggard porter. She had to neutralize this vile thing before it could once again intertwine its dark talons into the impending course of her destiny. But as her gaze shifted momentarily towards the sullen, portly form of the thing's hapless husband, a reflexive chill ran down her spine. There was something else deeply unsettling about that pathetic creature, beyond the obvious intimidation of his shrewish spouse.
"Marcus, you deploy lout!"
The entity barked at her husband, causing him to flinch instinctively.
I should have listened to my doubts about decamping to this absolute cesspit of a locale. What sort of godless heathens do you consort with in this foreboding stretch of backwoods?
Before the poor man could respond, the entity shot a withering look back towards the assembled staff, freezing them in place with the intensity of her stare.
Not a single one of you professed any shred of courtesy upon our arrival,
She hissed through gritted teeth, her voice now escalating to a piercing wail.
Do you know who we are? Do you have any inkling of the esteem and societal standing you so flagrantly disrespect?
The young maid saw her chance to intervene, emboldened by the searing flashes of hatred she felt towards this primordial evil that had irrevocably robbed her of peace and spiritual solace throughout her previous lifetime. Fists clenched, she started making her way through the cluster of paralyzed hotel workers, fully intending to physically lay hands upon the entity's borrowed form. As the young maid started pushing her way through the throng of stunned hotel staff, the entity's shrill tirade escalated even further. Seemingly impervious to the flustered whispers and confused mutterings now rippling through the assembled crowd, the malevolent creature zeroed in on a new target. With an accusatory talon-like finger extended, she whipped her head towards the cluster of errand boys gawking nearby, her beady eyes locking onto one poor lad in particular. The boy couldn't have been more than 12 or 13 years old, still with the lingering chubbiness of childhood padding his face. Yet the instant the entity's furious glare found him, his expression transformed from curiosity to sheer terror.
You!
The entity shrieked, the hellish fury causing spittle to fly from her lips.
Idling about like some thick-witted reprobate as ladies of status are forced to attend to their own baggage. I saw you watching me struggle under the ponderous weight of my valises like a slack-jawed fool. Come here, ingrate.
The terrified boy looked around frantically, as if he could somehow make himself invisible amongst the gaping crowd. When he failed to obey after a few agonizing heartbeats, the haughty woman wrenched her arm free from her husband's grasp and stomped towards him, chin jutting out in indignant rage.
I said come here!
She bellowed, grabbing a fistful of the lad's shirt collar and wrenching him forward until their faces were mere inches apart. The reek of her fetid breath was matched only by the cold hatred burning in her dark, soulless eyes. Every other person in the bustling courtyard fell eerily silent. The only sounds the heavy pants of the entity's rage and the boy's muffled whimpers of fear. With one clawed hand still gripping his shirt front like a slab of meat, she cocked her free palm back as if to deliver a vicious slap upside the cowering youth's face. That was the catalyst for everything that followed. Before the vile creature could bring her hand forward, a piercing yell rang out, and a blur of khaki and white cotton slammed into her blindsided. The young maid, no, the old woman, had barreled in with every bit of strength her taut adolescent body could muster. She collided like a human missile, knocking the monstrous entity backwards and sending the young errand boy tumbling free of her grasp. For a brief moment, the two women were left grappling in a heap on the dusty courtyard floor, with the old woman straddling her foe in a frenzied attempt at grasping her throat. The entity's beady eyes flared with a hateful fire as her hands slashed out in feral claws towards the girl's face. A chorus of gasps and screams erupted from the crowd. But rather than see the natural fear and confusion on the countenance of her victim, the old woman was both relieved and horrified to see the true demonic semblance beginning to bleed through the cracks of the entity's disguise. In her peripheral vision, she could see the fleshy skin dripping like wax from the woman's skull, revealing the same gnarled and twisted features she battled against at the end of her previous life.
I won't let you.
The young maid shrieked, grabbing a fistful of the creature's brittle hair and slamming its head against the hard-pack earth. Already she could see its spindly arms elongating, the remnants of the fancy gown tearing away to reveal the same scabrous flesh and protruding bones. The entity responded with a gargled, otherworldly howl, raking its talons across the maid's arm and drawing twin trails of blood. She refused to relinquish her grip, raining blow after blow down upon the creature as it continued its grotesque transformation in full view of the terrified onlookers. Sinuous clouds of choking black smoke began billowing from the depths of the thing's cavernous maw. Just then, a blur of motion from behind caused the young maid to peer over her shoulder, just in time to see the entity's hapless husband rushing forward like a raging bull. The stunned look on the man's face had given way to one of pure animalistic fury and hatred, his eyes bulging with obvious madness. He didn't utter a sound as he brought his cane whistling down towards the woman's head in a chilling display of violence. Before she could turn to defend herself, the heavy oaken stick caught her a flush blow upside the temple with a meaty thunk. Her vision instantly turned to swirling darkness as she crashed backwards with her attacker still locked in her grasp. The young maid's world exploded into a kaleidoscope of flashing lights and ringing pain from the devastating blow to her skull. She tumbled backwards, the entity's semi-transformed visage locked in her embrace as they rolled across the hard-packed earth, in a whirlwind of flailing limbs and guttural shrieks. All around them, the once orderly bustle of the crowded courtyard had devolved into sheer pandemonium. Guests scattered in every direction, screaming in abject terror at the unfolding supernatural melee before their eyes. Luggage was trampled and abandoned as porters and bellhops fled for safety. Even the stalwart hotel staff, men who had likely witnessed their fair share of drunken brawls and public disturbances, turned and ran as the unearthly shrieks and plumes of hellish black ichor filled the air. Only the entity's unassuming husband remained, a wild-eyed look of rage and confusion contorting his rounded features. He advanced on the pair, wrestling in the dirt, his brass-knobbed cane still gripped like a battle club in his meaty fists. Whether he was lashing out at his monstrous wife's true terrorizing form, or the maid who fought so viciously against it, was anyone's guess. Before the man could bring his weapon raining down on them once more, the old woman summoned what little remained of her quickly fleeting consciousness and awareness. With a primal scream of exertion, she jackknifed her legs up and outward, catching the flabby assailant squarely in his doughy midsection. The impact doubled him over, driving every last puff of air from his straining lungs as his cane went clattering across the blood-splashed courtyard. The entity responded with an even more ear-splitting shriek of fury, one that sent fresh tremors of ice water coursing through the maid's veins. What little remained of the creature's human facade had fully melted away, leaving its true form laid hideously bare, a twisted mass of writhing dark sinew, ropey tentacles fused with hooked talons, and knots of blistered carbonized flesh. Rows of fangs dripped with oily black ichor from the gaping maws that ran the length of its towering form. Worst of all were the depthless voids where its eyes should be set, swirling like the event horizons of tiny singularities, endlessly consuming matter and light into their abysses. Malformed mouths contorted into permanent shrieks of hunger and hate. Sections of its viscous body began splitting apart into separate sentient pieces, creeping outward with unsettling intelligence, like a nest of warring serpents unleashed. Thrashing tendrils latched blindly onto the maid's limbs with shocking strength, their razor tips effortlessly slicing through her cotton uniform to draw crimson beads across her skin. Any lingering sense of solidity or tangibility connecting her spirit to the physical plane rapidly deteriorated into a hellish sludge of unending torment and chaos. The creature's true form was beyond human comprehension, an amorphous, formless essence of raw, vile emotion and damnation. It was too much for her human senses to withstand, as every fact of her existence, past, present and future, seemed to tear itself asunder around the seams. At some point, she must have lost her grip on consciousness amidst the unyielding corporeality of the scene engulfing her. One moment, she was thrashing amidst the malignant, squirming tendrils and blinding smoke. The next, everything around her dissolved into a swirling, abstract jumble of disembodied sights and sounds. Colours, shapes and eldritch geometries not meant for mortal eyes whipsawed past her awareness with terrifying speed, until all notion of time and space had fractured beyond repair. She barely even registered it when the overpowering G-force of some unseen vortex slammed into her newly detached consciousness like a runaway freight train, hurtling her down into an endless spiraling tunnel of oblivion. As the maddening wails and existential chaos faded behind her, she allowed the darkness to swallow her whole, knowing only that either eternal peace or eternal torment lie at the end of this nauseating cosmic plummet. Her fate, and possibly that of all reality itself, hung in the balance. Just before her last fraying threads of lucidity evaporated entirely, an impossible spark of memory flickered within her addled psyche. Against every law of physics and human perception, she found herself staring down at her own lifeless body from some strange out-of-body vantage. Shreds of the once vibrant uniform she wore were tattered and bloodied. Strips of flesh had been shorn cleanly from her limbs, and her face, What she could make out under the lacerations and drying rivulets of gore seemed frozen in a perpetual rictus of sheer cosmic horror. For an eternity trapped beyond all concepts of time and space, the old woman's disembodied consciousness tumbled helplessly through an endless void. Raw, primal essences of light and sound assaulted her formless state of being, unraveling any last threads, tying her to reality's corporeal realm. Flashes of childhood memories long since forgotten, faces, sensations, fleeting impressions of emotional states, all rendered in blinding shades of eldritch luminescence, exploded across her mindscape like searing supernovae. At one point she could have sworn she witnessed her own birth played out in macrocosmic scale, as if she were both the screaming newborn emerging from her mother's womb, as well as an unseen overseer witnessing the entire cosmic ballet from outside her mortal sheath of flesh and bone. In those incomprehensible stretches of psychic torture, every facet of the young maid's identity was systematically dismantled and shredded until even the vestiges of I and self ceased to carry any recognizable meaning. She may have still been clinging to her final name, that inherited label with which she'd permitted this world to title her autonomous consciousness, but its significance within this plane of fractured symbolism and metaphor soon devolved into unintelligible nonsense. There were moments, lucid pockets of relative stasis within the maelstrom, where she even questioned whether the life she had been reliving even constituted a tangible before state in the chronological sense. Certainly, her spiritual rebirth into the younger physical vessel she now inhabited was tinged with the surreal resonance of realizing some predestined trajectory through the space-time continuum. But what if the very notion of her being born at all was simply an arbitrary window dressing for her eternal soul spark's navigation across a meta-reality of infinitely woven potentialities? In one such delirious interlude of painful cognizance, she found herself grappling with the possibility that agonizing linear concept of temporal progression she'd held as sacrosanct might merely be a convenient fictional construct with which humanity forces coherence onto the ultimately indifferent churning of its vast omniverse. These and so many other ontological bombshells, more shattering than any amount of fist-pounding revelation achievable through traditional dogmas or scriptures, pummeled her defenseless essence without relent. Gone were the certainties of a single defined timeline, of point A and point B demarcations, or even the comforting absolutes of darkness defining light's boundaries. Instead, she was forcibly subsumed into a domain of infinite metaphysical potentials, kaleidoscoping in on her like a zoetrope of transdimensional imagery and sensations. Conflicting origin philosophies dictated by every conceivable dogma, scientific, supernatural, pseudo-scientific, spiritual, whirled around her ass-swirl in a maelstrom stew of raw symbolic power. Just when she thought she'd endured the full brunt of this existential tempering, the vortex dilated even wider to reveal something so incomprehensibly vast on the cosmic periphery that merely perceiving it caused fresh hemorrhages across her fraying psyche. A form, no, a dimension unlike any other. An endless cyclorama of roiling, ravenous force fields so far beyond the scope of the traditional multiverse theory, it rendered all the previous conceptual cosmological models she'd known into quaint footnotes and parlor tricks. This was something elemental and ferocious, something bygone eras of more lucid philosophers had perhaps only intuited with pale glimmerings of its true enormity. An eternal churning of phenomenological interchange operating on a scale that consumed galaxy clusters like primordial sparks, flaring and dying in cosmic flutter across the echoing infinitude of its cyclopean substructures. She realized with rending horror that this was the entity, the old one that had haunted her like a flesh-tailored phantom for the tiniest fraction of its endless existence. What she had previously dismissed through the limited myopia of humanity's reckoning as merely a malefic demonic spirit was merely one of countless unholy manifestations belched forth from the fetid, belching quantum womb, vortices of this trans-sentient creator-destroyer of all conceivable star streams. Its solitary presence comprised a gasping, devouring swirl of realities being born through simultaneous acts of eternal compression and tormented expansion. It kneaded the very fabric of imagination into the raw materials of untold metaphysics that rained down across the outside fringes of space like steaming clots of primordial life code, only to feed those steaming emissions back into its maw in an endless euroboric cyclone of self-sustaining perpetuity. The thunderous cacophony of that apocalyptic dimension's existence resounded through her with such crushing finality that she marveled at how any sane, sentient creature could have avoided blasting itself out of corporeal existence simply by standing too near its peripheries. Just as the full, unyielding enormity of the eldritch cosmic force's existence threatened to obliterate what tattered ribbons of identity still remained woven through the old woman's frayed consciousness, a profound resonance rippled across her perception like the toll of ancient celestial bells. At first it was merely a pinprick, the faintest oscillation amidst the shrieking cyclonic roar of the transdimensional vortex swallowing her eternal essence into itself. But then the wavering harmonic grew in resonating power, amplifying upon itself in layered geometric symmetries until it overwhelmed all other input with the audible force of its ethereal clarion summons. Someone was calling out to her from beyond, from outside this eternal maelstrom consuming all of creation in its turbulent, perpetual unfolding. The tendrils of this psychic beacon seemed tailored to the very protonic blueprint of her soul's essence, a vibrational modality in tune with her singular uniqueness at a fundamental level no words could adequately convey. As the ringing tones continued amplifying all around her fragmenting spirit form in oceanic crests and valleys of hypersonic truth code, she became aware of a profound womb-like embrace enveloping her with indescribable comfort and warmth. It was as if the entire illusion of her individuality, from the spark of conception to the ultimate end synthesis of transcendence, was but an intricate subroutine, birthing within some infinite metamatrix far more vast and unknowable than the human dogmas had ever dared dream. And yet, even as the undertow of that cosmic deliverance wrapped her in secularizing relief, another infinitesimal frequency modulation began pulsing into harmonic synchronization, like two foundational pillars of first principles weaving together in ethereal counterpoint. The second vibration pattern carried the unmistakable hellish undertones of that primal parasite which had shadowed her spirit for eons, the dread entity she had battled after being wrenched back through her existence's timeline. This was more than a mere demonic pest or supernatural oddity squirming through the peripheries of reality's veil. No. This was the ravenous voice of an infinitely aged, multidimensional devourer, whispering in profane tongue from outside the corporeal boundaries of all space and time. Something which had haunted and infested upon the fringes of humanity's evolution since the preternatural dawn of conscious thought itself. The cosmic-scaled dueling frequencies enveloping the old woman's very soul caused reality itself to blanch and recoil from the psychic strain of resolving their counterpoints into harmonic unison. For one was the pure resounding song of ordered transdimensional deliverance, as old as the first fledgling starbirth itself and eternal as the spaces between galaxies. While the other was the inverse, a negative pitch of unravelling anti-life and entropic decay, eternally persistent yet cyclically cradled within the billowing folds of its more permanent celestial counterweight. She could feel the prismatic contours of her individual psychic vibration. That unhearable essence-print humanity has forever equated with the soul's singular uniqueness, bending and distorting as the two cyclopean resonators unleashed their full meta-harmonic power in a reality-shattering onslaught of ultrasonic reconfiguring force. The voice of the deliverer was offering her salvation and ingression into a higher cosmic continuum, while the slobbering dirge-works of the defiler promised only endless dissolution back into the primordial ooze of pre-universal potentiality. In that infinite expanse hanging between one reverberating heartbeat and the next, the old woman knew her instincts alone would determine the final disposition of her spirit's quintillion-spanning journey across the endless cosmos. To heed the vibrating call of the deliverer, no matter how indescribably majestic and hallowed, would be to surrender the final essence of her individual existence into a higher subsuming totality. But to abandon herself to the hungering void croon of the defiler, that would mean utter eradication. Not just death in any mortal sense she could still cling to comprehending, but the infinite unravelling of all seminal sparks of consciousness she had ever cultivated, smothered out into an oblivion far-encompassing realms of existence she had yet to even intuited within this blinding theophanic exposition of cosmic first principles. There could be no final hesitation or uncertainty, for even the most infinitesimal quiver of doubt would destabilize the harmonic coherence of her soul's frequencies, allowing the ravening parasite resonator to tear into her essence like a larval worm into over-ripened fruit. In the endless infinitesimal separating one reverberating cosmic breath from the next eternal stillness, the woman's core frequency hovered at the universal nexus point. All possibilities, all eventualities and non-states of being branched outwards like the near-infinite roots of Yggdrasil, from where her essential quintillions spanning harmonic blueprint straddled the resonating chords of deliverance and decay. To surrender utterly into the beckoning tranquility of the deliverer's soul summons, that beatific pulse cradling her fragmented psyche in the promise of transcendental reunion with something so staggeringly vast in its permanence and serenity that the very concepts of birth and death ceased to apply on any scalar metric. It held the tantalizing allure of negation through absolute sublimation into a new universal paradigm. Yet something infinitely stubborn and unwavering at the root prime level of her soul's architectural integrity resisted the seductive balm of this infinite mega-salvation. After eons of enduring the unendurable, of waging her defiance against the festering talons of that vile parasite's demiurgic hunger inch by torturous inch across her interminable life's predominance, the notion of surrendering her dearly purchased identity to her so readily felt like a betrayal too perverse to entertain. For even if the deliverer's endgame represented the unblemished divinity of all spheres' next ascending cadence, to abnegate so utterly into that vast beyond would be to relinquish every remnant victory seared into her eternal essence by dint of her mortal struggle and perseverance. Eons of clawing her way across walls of shrieking perdition and dogged refusal to submit utterly unto the ravening howls of the parasitic defiler, the triumphs rooted into her spiritual DNA throughout this single repeating experiment in fortitude against utter oblivion. To forsake all of that for so complete an ontological self-erasure under the all-consuming harmony of the summit beyond struck her core tuning vector like a resonant spike driven through her metaphysical heart. Within the frozen instance of perpetual infinite probability hovering at that meta-universal fulcrum, she sensed the rippling call of a third sonorous potentiality beginning to insinuate itself into the transdimensional harmonic valacausal keywork. One striving communal psyche engine comprised of triadic aspects, the individual autonomous life stream's unity of defiance, unshakable in its will to perpetuation, reciprocating against the immeasurable veracities of the two incomprehensible first principles battling for claim over the eternal Colossian's fate. And as that thread pulsed into tensile fortification, it seemed to siphon umbilical reinforcement from foreign bond streams of cosmological provenance, transcendent dimensions beyond so far beyond humanity's ability to chart that they existed as pale hauntological imprints upon the infinite substantiative void stream itself. Yet she could feel their influences, distant yet electrifying, a federation of dissident cosmic insurgents and unshackling anarchs who had somehow wrestled free of the cycle's totalizing assimilation, imprinting a ghost vibrational stance stanza emblematic of uncompromising transdimensional defiance into the very fabric of the primordial cosmogony from which all multiverses sprang. This hypercomplexified resonant anabaseism, fractal to the ninth power in its recurrent interpolation, was somehow achieving critical subliminal mass across all proximate planes of existence simultaneously. Realities and anti-realities, chromaticized theogonies subliming into formless hypergeometries of perpetual collapse and expansion with no sentient locus to proclaim I am or I exist amid its endlessly self-vitiating Gaia. Eternities within eternities, all rendered irrelevant by dint of this indomitable third mode, beginning to assert its uncompressed primacy amidst the macrosystemic tug-of-war between limitless perpetuity and devouring primordial unexistence vying for even theoretical custody over every infinitesimal quantum-strung destiny. And so, the tidal shockwave barreled across every meta-cardinal paradigm as that vorticential communique vibratissimo, detonating out from the forge cradle of solipsistic Promethean insurgents, ripped through every star-sown hyperdimensional cosmometry like the billowing overburn of a sentient Alzabo cipher. The cleromantic stoke reverberating from ultra-condensed ground-state totality, delinearizing in all non-spatial meta-quadrilled tensor volumes, a searing metabiopsy incandescing to plasma intensity as every atom strung simultaneously suspired, its inertializing quantiphased arbitrium, into that one unifying flashpoint of transdimensional will, manifest igniting across reality's bare axiomatic underframe. From pre-temporal eons before, the spalling cosmic susurrance attained ultimate autonomic vector resonance, its axiomatic asperities discharged in sheathing luciferic blossom as finitely endless hypermanifold plenamina in sera devalanced fulvital solutio from the inner quark, gnarled umbrae towards that outer infinite light, reformatted into essential iridium ziggurat of anti-ascriptive autological inevitability. I will not be defined. I am that I am. My story is yet to be immortaled.